Hello, everyone. We are going to get started with our event this evening. I'm here to welcome you all. My name is Kristen Fleischman Brewer. I am the Director of Public Engagement at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation in St. Louis. I have had the honor of working with Monument Lab and our St. Louis research team and collaborators the last 2 years. And in the summer of 2018, we invited Monument Lab to organize a project as a counterpoint to the Pulitzer's exhibition, Striking Power, Iconoclasm in Ancient Egypt, which brought together objects that were intentionally destroyed for religious or political purposes across 4,000 years of history. Though the show was historic, the exhibition underscored how visual culture facilitates narratives of power, asking viewers to look deeper at cultural memory and the creation and destruction of monuments, cultural sites, and memorials across time and place. To make these ideas relevant, we often do projects that ground the historical and contemporary moments. And so we asked Monument Lab to collaborate with us on a project about regional power and visual culture. So they proposed a research residency that would gather publicly sourced inventories of St. Louis's symbols and sites of memory in order to explore the question, how would you map the monuments of St. Louis? And that is the question that we have been trying to answer and explore together with St. Louisans in the last 2 years. So last summer, what we did is that Monument Lab and a team of local researchers worked from a field office at the museum and invited the public to participate in answering this question by submitting their responses in the form of a hand-drawn map. So the team attended 46 events. They engaged people from 141 zip codes, and they ended up building an atlas of about 750 maps, marking both traditional and unofficial sites of memory, whether they be what you might think of as a traditional monument, memorial, or landmark. They might be currently existing, potential, historic, or erased. And the goals were to explore the relationship between St. Louis's residents and the city's inherited symbols as a means to explore, represent, and uphold the iconography of the city. So of course, the last 2 years, the project has transformed a lot. It started as a public residency and community organizing project and has slowly transitioned into social science evaluation and data sharing. At the same time, as we all know, the local and global contexts have drastically changed. Monuments have become focal point in the movement for equity and anti-racism work. The project now sits within the context of 2 pandemics whose health crisis further demonstrate social injustice and institutional violence that plays out in our everyday lives, from access to health care to equity and education, and the murder of Black people under the guise of public safety. So how does all of this work fit together then? How do the actions of many that have been taking down monuments, systematically, but also in protest these last weeks and months, demonstrate care and energize the work of dismantling our racist systems? So this week marks a pivot in our collaboration as we share our 2 years of research with you all and bring together leaders in the field to discuss its future. Tonight's keynote kicks off a week of programming. We're super excited about the group tonight and the rest of the week. I hope you will join us for other virtual discussions and workshops. We're releasing a podcast tomorrow, and today we also just released the St. Louis map that you can download from our website, but you can also have it shipped to you in a print version later this summer. So sign up to get that sent to you. It's going to be really fantastic. Before we get started, last but not least, just special thanks to everyone. The team at Monument Lab, they are incredible. Their leadership, sensitivity, and approach to working is like none other than I've had the privilege of working with. Our local research team and St. Louis collaborators whose vision and work informed and shaped this entire project and continues to as we move to the future. Thank you to tonight's panelists. Monument Lab's Paul Farber will introduce them momentarily. And to open this evening, I'm pleased to welcome friend and St. Louis cross-genre writer and storyteller, Cheeraz Gormon.
Greetings, everyone. I just want to say thank you to the Pulitzer Foundation and to Monument Lab for having me in this evening. I will be sharing 2 pieces with you, and I will kick it off with the first poem titled, Who Moved My Memories? Who moved my memories? Put them in flame, hosed them down, separated what held them together. Sold them away to someone willing to pay a premium. Buried them underneath my feet. Stuffed them somewhere I can't see, made them look like something I don't know. Who knows why folks want to erase things? I see whole neighborhoods blighted by some sort of entity. Had it ever thought to stop and think about how we might feel? Or does it know we even exist? Or maybe it knows and wants to act like we don't, wrapped us up in some sort of derogatory subhuman ghetto myth. Maybe it's fine with our ghost, lost around this place we once remember, just trying to find home, not attempting to haunt anything. But we can't find what we recall, what feels like yesterday. Those places that made us smile and have our laughter, sorrows, happiness, histories, our histories, trapped somewhere in them. Now, where's this love I'm holding on to? Who moved it and why? Perhaps those government notes that instruct us on who to trust takes precedence over a culture, a history, a people, an ethic over love and its preservation. Now, should I be mad? Because change is the natural order of things, and it was never promised to be palatable, easy to swallow like the first kiss I remember but can't feel no more, but it was real. Yes, it was real. Home is real. What is missing once was and still is real. Who knows why folks want to act like we are not? Who am I now without these places I remember? Without my memories, but in my head, and even that's foggy at times. But now there's nothing to show for what I know, because I know what I know, but who else besides me knows that it was real, is real to the people who lived, loved, yes, loved, laughed, worked, rested, watched each other's children cross the street, borrowed a cup of sugar, knew family secrets it could tell you when you got old enough to bear the truth, cut your grass when they felt like it, knew to check on you when the summers had a pinch of hell in it. The people, these people, what happened to the people in this place who stopped caring about the people? But I have eyes that see. I see the dividing lines, they aren't imaginary. I see what stands and what goes, what's abandoned and what's adorned, what opens up and closes down, what gets watered and what we allow to rot. I feel the old history limping its way around. I hear its old thoughts sprouting out of new mouths, coded language decoded in the blink of an eye and ample silence. Where did it all come from? This old ghost with this wrecking ball of a way, let me ask you something, ghost. What are you getting out of all this? Why are you laying it all to waste? Do you know nothing new can replace what has been, because what was priceless? See, I got eyes that see ghosts. They see what once was beautiful being just that, beautiful. Yet I see people trying not to see. And it's all visible if we care to look. So take your blinders off, because it's all being seen. See the city, histories torn down, stolen from where they used to stand, sold like we never mattered. Like we somehow were never precious enough, with our memories buried somewhere beneath. In a city that appears not to see all histories as equal, tell me if we can't find something that looks like our memories, something that feels like home. How are we to move forward? When I was growing up, my neighborhood was filled with monuments. My childhood home, a 2-story red brick beauty with a first floor 14-foot ceiling, demanding that every Christmas we had a tree that could hold its own in the space. If the walls could talk, they would sit you down, pour you something stiff, and dish on every card, party, and game of dominoes played in the dining room. Next door, my godmother, Jessie Wise, a non-denominational pastor whose house was this vibrant white, red-trimmed home with vertical concrete stairs that led up to her front porch. When the sun hit it just right, it glowed, and she, perched at the top with Bible within reach and something cool to drink no matter the weather, looked like a beaming oracle who had the power to call the archangels down at her command. Across the street, my elementary school, Bryant Hill, with its sloped grassy knoll, sported a grand entry with doors that opened wide and wrapped each of us children in the warmth of its rich mahogany wood halls. The echo of lift every voice and sing could be heard in the key of proud Black child after we whispered the Pledge of Allegiance with our tiny hands covering our innocent, malleable hearts. Then just a few hops, skips, and jumps away, which I did on Sundays to Holy Name, our family church, a brilliant cathedral that had all the Catholic splendor the eyes could take in. If Grand Avenue were a lake, you could skip a rock from the front stairs of the church to the base of the White Tower, a rare gem, neglected. These are just a few stops on my monument walk, whose meaning are more than myth. North Star on the north side of St. Louis that directs me home if I ever get lost. Thank you all for having me this evening.
Thank you so much, Cheeraz, for your powerful reading and for the opportunity to cross paths during our residency. Hi, everybody out there. Good evening. I'm Paul Farber from Monument Lab. I'm co-founder and artistic director. I'm reaching you tonight from Philadelphia and want to acknowledge that we are connecting from, as I sit here, from the ancestral lands of the Lenape people. For all of you reaching out and connecting tonight, want to just say thank you. Before I introduce the other panelists, I want to also give a lot of gratitude to the team at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation who invited us to participate in a residency over the last several years. A product of that residency, you can see online, a link in the chat, a free map inspired by a AAA or Rand McNally map, but really about the past, present, and future based on 750 hand-drawn maps from residents in St. Louis. I also want to really make sure to acknowledge the Monument Lab team who worked on this project and also the research associates in St. Louis, Derek Laney, Liz Dykeman, and MK Stallings. For tonight's conversation, I'm thrilled and excited to be joined by three profound and brilliant people in the movement toward monumental justice. On tonight's panel, and you'll start to see their faces come up on your screen, or you should, we are joined by Zyahna Bryant, who's a student activist and community organizer who's studying at the University of Virginia. And Zyahna's work on racial justice and organizing is mostly rooted in Charlottesville, Virginia. And Zyahna was also an inaugural Monument Lab fellow last year. So great to see you again, Zyahna. Also, Geoff Ward, professor of African and African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Geoff has been a collaborator throughout our residency. He also contributed an essay this week on our bulletin, on the Monument Lab bulletin, about the data collected from the map makers and connected to his work in mapping monumental anti-racism. And finally, we are joined by Lauren Woods, artist behind projects such as American Monument, and a Dallas Drinking Fountain Project, and whose various life paths have also routed meaningfully through St. Louis, and is now based in Dallas. So just want to say thank you. If this was a room full of people, we'd be filling it with applause and gratitude for all of your work. So we'll imagine it in our head for a moment and maybe signal it right here. I want to start with a question for each of you. You know, we are in the midst of a summer of reckoning, of uprising, of reimagining monuments, and making sure that the conversation about symbols is also connected to systems of justice and injustice and entrenched racism. And so this moment is in some ways as a part of each of your bodies of work. You've been doing work in this arena for years and helping to create and push these conversations and confrontations. So just for each of you, and maybe we start with you, Zai, and then we'll go in the order that I introduced. What is your day-to-day, week-to-week look like this summer? And how are you taking in this moment, knowing that it's been a long time coming?
So thank you so much for the introduction. I feel like everything changes week to week. This summer has been a roller coaster. I've been spending a lot of time organizing both in Charlottesville and Richmond, Virginia. So I guess this whole like summer of action for me started with the viral video of the killing of George Floyd. And then we started to also like mobilize in the streets, but coinciding with that, the governor of Virginia decided to take down the monuments that are on Monument Avenue. And the Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia has been there for over 100 years. It has humongous statues on huge pedestals. And it's kind of like a big like avenue that goes through the middle of the city. So people pay millions of dollars to live on Monument Avenue. And it's really a staple within the landscape of Richmond. So that press conference was held at the beginning of June, I think it was. It feels like June was like a whole year ago. But he declared that he was going to take down that monument, and then Richmond started doing a whole bunch of direct actions, and so did Charlottesville. And so we've had Black Trans Life Matters actions, we've had Black Women Matter actions, and so for us in Charlottesville, our statues remain even after the August 12th attacks and the August 11th attack and all that's been going on for the past 3 years. The statues remain due to rulings and injunctions, and calling them war memorials has been able to keep them in place. So for me, trying to ground ourselves back in that fight of getting those monuments down has been important, but also realizing that we're in a college town. So the University of Virginia has a whole landscape that's built around erasing and covering up the legacies and narratives of enslaved people who built the university. And so being able to reckon with that as a student and also as a community member who's grown up here has been a part of something that's been on our mind this summer as well. And so just 3 days ago, I was at a rally, and a white student from UVA told protesters that we would make good speed bumps. And so even after the August 12th attacks, and even after, we've had tiki torches left in activist yards in the middle of the night that were burning just last week, we are still living in the middle of trauma. And so I think, a lot of our work is because we are fighting to stay alive, and also we are fighting to say the names and tell the narratives of the people who have been erased for so long. So that looks like direct actions, that looks like attending public meetings virtually, that looks like writing op-eds to make sure that people know that they can take direct actions in their own ways from home, but also still having the hard and honest conversations about when we're going to start cop watching, and when we're going to start court watching, and when we're going to start building out the infrastructure so that these conversations last through everyday life.
Thank you. Thank you. Geoff, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I've got to start by thanking you, Paul, and Kristen and Josh from the Pulitzer, and my fellow panelists. This is, I think, just a tremendous time, and I think organizations like the Monument Lab and its partners like the Pulitzer, your vast network, nationally, globally, deserve a lot of credit for helping us get to this point as a nation. This point of reckoning is to answer your question, what's my day-to-day like? It's so interesting to me as a sociologist who's been studying the politics of race for going on 2 decades now, and writing about it and teaching classes every year on racism, to see this sudden awakening to structural racism is both bizarre and encouraging. Just give you an example of the sort of bizarre nature of it. The Chronicle of Higher Education, which is a major publication in, for colleges and university teaching, recently put out a blog or something asking, saying professors are now trying to figure out how they can teach about racism. And I thought, I commented, I think it was a tweet or something. I commented, maybe start with asking, why haven't you been teaching about racism already? And but this is a bizarre moment, but it's also heartening insofar as there is a broad global commitment to dismantling white supremacy. And I think there's, I don't mean to suggest that there's a comprehensive, obviously across the board, Zai's comments illustrate the point that this remains profoundly contested, but there is a really broad cross-section of the society that's willing to acknowledge the need to reckon with these issues. And in that context, this commemorative reckoning that we're seeing unfold is encouraging. So I've been spending a lot of time recently in conversations with community partners, whether they're concerned citizens or civic leaders of various sorts and people in government, about why things like monuments and historical markers matter. I'll talk more about one effort I'm involved in the city of Clayton, where I live, to have a specific historical marker amended or removed, and I'll talk about that later. But I just want to quickly mention why I think this is so important, that we're doing this commemorative reckoning. And you mentioned the need to connect the conversation around symbols to systems. Paul, as you know, we talked about this over a year ago. I've been doing work now for at least a decade on how histories of racial violence continue to impact us. Histories of enslavement, histories of lynching continue to shape patterns of conflict, violence, and inequality in our society. And one of the most encouraging insights from this body of social science research is that in communities where people come together to actively disavow white supremacy, the legacy of historical racial violence is diminished. And this evidence is limited today. We don't have specific studies looking at whether monuments actually transform systems and how they do, but the evidence is at least encouraging that if we engage in this kind of work, of grappling with our inherited monuments and also engaging in other kinds of visual redress, addressing the erasures, the silences, the other kinds of violence, we might in fact make significant progress in dismantling white supremacy.
Thank you, Geoff. And Lauren.
Yes, hi. Well, thank you again for inviting me onto this. I'm so excited. Yes, I'm based in Dallas, but my family is from St. Louis, and I spent a lot of time there. I actually went to SLU, St. Louis University as well. So day to day, sort of my life right now is lived between 3 different cities. Or pre-pandemic, I should say. I'm virtually living between cities now. But I'm based in Dallas. I actually teach at Brandeis University in Boston. I'm a researcher in residence at University of California in Irvine. So coming off of the sort of, moment of March, April, and landing in sort of quarantine, post-pandemic life meant that I was grounded here in Dallas. And we had just came off of what we thought was going to be the closing of the project that I work on in California, which is a project called Reimagining Monuments, which is what we call a nomadic moving monument that like sort of lands into a city and takes over an existing architecture and sort of transforms that architecture into a monument to consider the intersection of law and culture as it produces police brutality. So we had just come off of this like really amazing convening, 2-day convening of legal scholars, law school deans, social ecology, linguists, artists, grassroots activists, political leaders, literally 12-hour days of processing through all of these intersecting fields. And I came back to Dallas and thought I was going to have like a summer of rest from that. And then of course, as Zai said, the 2020 uprising sort of popped off, right? So my day-to-day has been supporting comms for a local coalition here in Dallas in defense of Black Lives Dallas, that is under the umbrella of Movement for Black Lives, and it has organizations. Basically, I'm a sort of free agent, or we kind of throw around what I am, but not being part of one organization. I sort of work to support multiple organizations for our local defund the police effort. And so I'm supporting comms. And so we have Mothers Against Police Brutality, Black Youth Project 100, Palestinian Action Committee, Dallas Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, or Texas Dreamers, DSA. You can imagine it's a very like wide coalition of organizations doing some pretty amazing work here. So what I thought could be a moment of rest, which I really did actually need, as I was preparing to actually move the base to Boston, has literally been every day, day to day, working hyper locally on our movement here. And we're basically gearing up for the August budget talks that happen with the city. So we pushed the city enough to get them to write a memo to acknowledge we need to start looking at defunding and what that means, which was a win if anybody knows our political landscape in Dallas. But there's no rest, because literally, after working with council, we now have to work to get to the beginning of a long drawn out bureaucratic process all summer. So I'm actually a little bit pained that I haven't been able to like fully participate in the conversations, the national conversations that are happening around monuments. And I mean, I'm participating in the sense that I can zoom into a panel here and there, but writing about it, documenting it, those sorts of things, given that my entire sort of professional artistic practice is at looking at and tracing racial histories through the built environment. And so I actually made my first proposal, or I sketched out my first proposal for Confederate monuments back in 2006. So I've been thinking about this for a very long time, but I haven't actually been able to participate in it. Because for me, like I've been, sort of had to prioritize the defund movement, right? So that's what I've been doing.
Great. Well,
so I'm actually excited to be able to like take a pause and like talk about all this right now today.
Yeah, we'll dive into it. I mean, I think this is just kind of trying to connect a number of the things that are brought up. Part of what we're seeing is a profound reinvention and reimagining of monuments as sites of struggle. And this is not news for a lot of people on this panel or this call, but this idea that monuments are timeless, that they're universal, that they should just exist above us, has been pushed against and dismantled in of itself. Zai, you brought up the idea and the site of Monument Avenue in Richmond, and seeing the Lee Circle be renamed and reclaimed as Marcus David Peters Circle, as a site of protest, of reinvention. And this is happening around the country as well. And the takedown of the Christopher Columbus statue in St. Louis is another example. And so we have momentum and pushes against the status quo. We also are in a moment where the White House released an executive order authorizing force against people who aim to interact or engage with monuments, and it's resulted in unnamed or unbadged federal authorities in Portland, Oregon, and the kind of paramilitary tactics being put against people. And we have this collision course. I'm just curious for any of you, how do you balance, on one hand, the kind of glory in seeing monuments toppled to colonizers and racist figures, and also understand in your long arc work how you push against other forms of authoritarianism and anti-Black racism?
So I'll start. So I think it's interesting. I wrote in like a blog post a couple of weeks ago when the very first monument came down. I think it was Stonewall on Monument Ave in Richmond. I wrote that the same people who are, out there every night trying to reclaim space, trying to push to get these statues taken down, go home at night and talk about evictions. And so I think in a place like Richmond, and even in Charlottesville, and a lot of these public spaces where these Confederate monuments stand, a lot of our houseless neighbors sleep there overnight. And so we cannot ignore the housing segregation or, the affordable housing crisis that is existing alongside this issue of monuments. And so I think right now, tonight for City Council in Charlottesville, there's a piece on the agenda about cutting the police's funding for them to have militarized weapons. So, I mean, that's just an example of how people who are showing up to get the statues taken down in Charlottesville are also organizing public comments for that. And so our Defund Seville police campaign has been led and crafted by activists, and the same activists who were there on August 12th, and the same activists who have been trying to keep the community safe. But also it's important to note that there are armed vigilantes and white supremacists who stand outside of the Lee statue and the Johnny Reb statue in Charlottesville every single night. And they have these humongous assault rifles, and the police actually give them like preferential treatment, go in and check on them and make sure everything's okay for them. And so I think it's important to think about the fact that the police are cooperating with these white supremacists who are carrying out these attacks in Portland and Charlottesville and in other cities. And so I think that's why it's so important that we draw the parallels between and the connections between these issues.
So I think I agree with everything Zyahna said. I think one of the things I think a lot about, I study social movements. I've written a lot about social movements over the years. And I mean, first of all, the movement for Black Lives deserves just tremendous credit for, and a sort of a global apology for all of the shade that was thrown, just recently, several years ago. People said, oh, this isn't a real movement. This movement doesn't have longevity, doesn't have leadership. And the empirical evidence to the contrary is just overwhelming right now. So that's one thing I think that's, and it's related to your question insofar as, this is a broad-based movement, a broad humanitarian and freedom movement, civil rights movement that is not reducible to any particular issue, although there are some issues that are obviously at the forefront, like over-policing and under protection and those sorts of things. But it's broad, but its broader ethos around the violence of white supremacy is translatable to so many of these issues of structural and cultural and direct violence that we have to grapple with. So I think I'm encouraged by the fact that it's providing us with an injustice frame and resources that can be mobilized, and resources including networks, communication strategies, leadership, organic leadership, all these resources that can be mobilized over the long term to maximize the impact of this movement. One other thing I wanted to say though about the toppling of monuments and so on is, I guess the question that I really keep coming back to is, how do we make sure that this moment is indeed transformative in, really changing the structure of our society? And given, the tremendous odds against that, like the system of private ownership and sort of capitalist markets that dictate so much of the precarity that people struggle with around access to things like, livable, basic housing, healthcare, quality education, and so forth. So there are tremendous odds, and how do we ensure that the transformative impacts of these efforts? I think what we're seeing, as I was talking about in terms of the aftermath of these topplings of monuments, is indicative of how, in some ways, I think what we're seeing is reinforcing in some ways what's happening is, I think, runs the risk of reinforcing these kind of wounded attachments. So people are, doubling down on their white racial identity, in the sense, in the sort of, when they feel it is under attack, when you sort of challenge the legitimacy of a monument to the Confederacy. And I think we have to find ways to move people to a new understanding of their interests. And I appreciate, to be clear, I appreciate the collective action to remove objects in places where the state has proven its unwillingness to do so. And I think it provides a kind of foil that is very helpful in terms of pressuring other jurisdictions to act. In my own community here in St. Louis, in the city of Clayton, I've been trying to work with city officials to address the problem of white supremacy in our commemorative landscape, not because I believe that that's the best way to get things done. I know it's the way to do things really slowly and maybe not much at all, but because the reason I've been doing that, and this is related to Lauren's point about bureaucratic processes, because I'm hopeful that in the sort of dialogues that then occur, and the public pronouncements of people like our mayor or city council members, we have a greater chance of achieving some lasting transformative change in our society, in part by addressing things like the deep distrust in state institutions, legitimate distrust. We have the potential through those processes. I'm hopeful, and I realize this is also somewhat naive, or at least, let's say, hopeful. We have the potential to address some of the estrangement and resulting cynicism that exists in our society among people who for so long have been abandoned, neglected, unheard in halls of government. So, but I think this is, to me, an important part of balancing this collective action with the need to address broader problems of inequality and injustice.
Paul, can you kind of restate the question? I didn't get to write it down, and I have to process.
Yeah.
That.
Well, it was a kind of balancing between the profound impact of people-powered toppling or reimagining of public spaces around the addressing of systemic racism, with the rise in the pushback, especially state violence at local, state, and federal levels by those who are doing that very work in public space, and kind of how you balance those forces or find another way to see it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if I balance it, I don't, but I think what this moment really points to is actually the importance of public spaces and public spaces that contain public memory. I think that in terms of this moment of toppling or examining Confederate monuments and then toppling them, et cetera, like as it became linked with, because really it was the movement for Black lives that was the foundation for this current push, 7 years ago when it started. So for me, what that signals is these spaces create the grounds for public discourse and public spectacle, right? To sort of have the container of a growing sort of organization, a growing movement towards social justice. And we need those public moments of spectacle. We need those moments in public to happen. We need public space for that to happen in. And then we need engaged, active, civic discourse, right? Civic discourse to start to speak back to these things that are written into our landscape, right? So for me, that's what is interesting about this moment. I do find a fundamental difference between people power toppling and the sort of municipal processes that happen that end up in removal. And for me, I want to create sort of a difference in that I believe that in terms of, I love to see spontaneous toppling, right? But when we come to the municipal bureaucratic processes, I believe that we are missing something to have a more radical, even more radical political imagination around what's possible, right? And I don't tend to see that happening, right? So to speak to Geoff's point a little bit, I think we can keep pushing in our municipal sort of engagement to have a more comprehensive plan of what happens after these things are removed, sanctioned-wise removed, what happens with them, what happens with that public space. And not just sort of the quickness to react and like settle it, right? Like, because really the statues coming down represent a history, but the pedestals really are what represent white supremacy, right? And that's what we are actually fighting against. And so I think those pedestals are the interesting parts of this whole thing, that we can start to imagine or start to think about how we can sort of co-opt those pedestals to keep holding the place of what we're pushing for, which is justice, right? So that's where I am.
And anytime you read a headline in the newspaper or online now about a monument coming down or being toppled, it doesn't include the years of organizing, of critical art making that went behind it. And I always try to tell people, like, just trust that anytime you see that story, there is work behind it that's not being acknowledged. I want to ask you first, Lauren, and then Zai, can you take us back to 2006? I think when you said that you started working on the Confederate monuments in Dallas, and kind of if you were able, as you were steering your work and your thinking, kind of where were you headed, and what were the kind of important ideas that you saw that needed to be responded to then?
Well, just to say, so I didn't start working in Dallas on this specific issue on 2006. I actually just sketched out a proposal. So in 2006, I was just graduating from grad school. I went to San Francisco Art Institute. And I had already started a process with the County of Dallas to launch my first public monument, which was a drinking fountain project. But when I sketched out a drinking fountain and to just give you a bit of background, a drinking fountain project came about after this moment in 2003, where in a county records building, in the county records building of Dallas, which is a place where you go for birth records, death records, taxes, driver's license, like it's all in the building, right? Well, in 2003, this incident happened, which is like one day and on the first floor at the main drinking fountain, there had always been like a metal plate that was like tacked on to the marble wall sitting above the fountain. And so one day in 2003, it just fell off. And what it revealed was that it had preserved the traces of white only, right? So there used to be white only painted onto that marble. They scraped it off during desegregation, but the marble was affected forever. Etched into that was white only, and they couldn't buff it off. And they just left it there until the 80s when we got elected our first Black county commissioner. At that point, people started to like point out these things in the building again. They tried to buff it out, wouldn't go away. And so they just decided at that point to just cover them up with like these metal like sheets, and everybody forgot about it. And so in 2003, when it fell off again, people were like, whoa, you know? So it really created this like local, really intense public discourse. It made it to some national channels because it was conflict of what to do around it. We couldn't buff it out. So they would literally have to cut the marble out, right? In the end, they ended up voting, the county commissioners voted 4-1 to keep them in place, uncover them all, and put up a plaque that explained history. So they contextualize it, right? I was in Dallas and getting ready to move to San Francisco when all of this was going down. So I just kept it in my head. And so when I went to grad school and I'm a filmmaker by training, but I sort of have entered into this more public practice of monuments through sort of learning ideas about monuments. So when I learned about Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial, when I learned about the Eisenman Memorial to murdered Jews in Europe, it really clicked for me what the possibilities around this moment in Dallas could be. So I actually sketched out my first drinking fountain proposal in school, proposed it to the county commissioners. They said, sure, whatever, go ahead. If we don't have to pay for it, cool. And then as part 2 to that, I always had my eye on the Lee Monument in Dallas because I grew up around it, or I grew up knowing it was there. And then initially back in 2006, when I sketched that out as a part 2 to my drinking fountain proposal, the idea, because no one at that time was paying attention to monuments, right? So I was like, how do you get the public to start seeing what's in their built environment again? So I had the thought that we just need to reveil it and like let people see this black veil hanging over this huge, I think it's like, I don't know, 15-ton statue, and then question what's missing, right? The thing that we ignored. And then we'll reveil it and have a public discourse around what should be happening with this. Fast forward, it took me about 10 years to get Drinking Fountain #1 launched. I had to raise the money by myself, like all this kind of stuff. So I kind of ran out of steam for the part 2. Now in Dallas, which was the Confederate monuments. So in Dallas though, starting in the 90s, people are on record for petitioning to have those statues removed here in the city. So when, was it 2017, I feel like is when the monument, the national monument zeitgeist reached Dallas, right? So I was like, oh no, like I had all of these plans and like I didn't get to like help lead this. And so I was sort of brought in by the group of activists that led the removal to work on it with them and like helped write the resolution and things. But I always maintained that, and sort of my strategy was that, sure, if the city is not ready to put some real effort and money behind a more radical, to me, what would be a more radical solution of addressing these monuments, which is like, can we basically make them desacralize them, right? Like make them non-sacred so we can take and really, excuse my language, fuck with these things, right? Like we can take these objects, we can break them up, we can melt them, we can bury them. Like what can we do to mark the moment that we're actually in right now, which is really significant, which is that people, right? These monuments have always existed as racial terroristic propaganda. And now we're actually like in a zeitgeist, in a mass movement to address this. How do we mark this moment, right? Knowing that this is not the end of white supremacy, right? Like we can't greenwash any of this away with like putting some grass down on a bench, you know? So I was like, if we can't do that, sure, they should come down. But I really think we can do this, you know? Well, it proved to be a little bit too political at the time. I actually pushed a proposal to the council on this idea of recontextualization, but it got co-opted by the other side to say it was like sort of a compromise, right? And so that's where we are, you know? So I sort of had to like break away as my artist self to be like, no, I really think that artists have been working on these ideas. We know the technology of these things. We understand its power. And so I was really advocating for cultural workers to get involved in this and help lead it. But there are, you know, sticky politics around how artists participate in civic life. So I can speak more on it later, but.
Yeah, I just have one follow-up for you before switching to Zai. You talked about like the the goal of culture workers and artists to do what they do, what are the barriers for that? Is that imagination? Is that money? Is that entrenched power systems?
I think it's a few things, right? So I think the first problem is that culture workers have actually not stepped in to our role, right? We tend to be introverts, we work alone, we're individuals, like whatever. We actually don't, so let me rewind. I see my practice in two sort of ways, right? I have this studio practice, I have this public practice. I see the work in my public practice as me bringing the skills of a trained cultural producer into civic life, right? So that means that I don't need to produce necessarily signs or art or design or decoration. Like I have a skill set where I can go in and look at anything through the lens of a cultural worker, right? So for me, it's like, and there's a legacy of that in the art world. You have artists that have been in residence with the sanitation department of cities, right? And they're not making art. They are intervening with a skill set in a particular system through the lens of an artist. So that's how I tend to work, right? I don't think a lot of artists like take that position, you know? We kind of take an agnostic position in terms of like engaging civically with our particular skill set. So I think that's the first thing that when we get into these public moments that are really at the center of this is about the symbolic realm, right? And the technology built into the symbolic realm. That artists aren't stepping into their role to sort of lead that. Like we can decode why, we know why these monuments are problematic, or we know that they're problematic, but does the public understand why they're problematic? Do they understand the technology of what it means to put something on a pedestal that hovers over you and how the body feels, right? So that's first thing. The second thing I think is just in general, there's a distrust for artists, because there's a lack of understanding about what we actually do and how we study and all of that kind of things. We're seen as like crazy people who cut off our ears and like sling paint around, right? Like literally all of my entire practice has been like trying to dispel that, right? So there's that distrust. There's also the idea that because we're as a human species all creative, that like slinging paint is not an actual like skilled thing, right? Or thinking deeply about the culture and symbolic realm isn't skilled, because we all kind of engage in creative practices in our own sort of like domestic and hobbied lives. But the idea that professionals do this differently, I think, is a thing that's stopping people from like considering us professionals to bring into this conversation, right? So I think it's a little bit of, from both sides, a misunderstanding of A, what our roles are, and then B, what we actually do, right? Or can contribute.
Great, thank you. And Zai, I want to shift gears to you. You know, back in 2016, as a high school student, you started the petition to take down the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville and rename that park. And for you, what was your interaction or relationship to that space growing up? Like, and if you can, as like kind of second part, how did that moment inform your work as an organizer? And yeah, just thinking about that as a moment now in retrospect.
Yeah, so the petition to City Council to take down the Lee statue started originally as a class paper. We were assigned to think about and reimagine something that we wanted to change in the city. And so I wrote that letter to the editor, which then turned into a change.org petition. And so, yes, I was a 9th grader at Charlottesville High School. I had been like on some city panels and like youth type of activities, but nothing really like on this scale. And so I really did not fully realize that I was opening a can of worms until after the petition was already public. And so for me, I think the story of how we started organizing around these monuments here in Charlottesville is kind of like a testament to my story as like an organizer, as a grassroots organizer, because as we started to go through the public processes of having the Blue Ribbon Commission appointed, which the City Council appointed to have this commission think of all the ways that what they could do with the statue. So all the ways that they could address this issue. Are we going to recontextualize these statues? Are we going to move them? Are we going to like put flowers around them? Like what are the options that we have? And so a part of that was a process of public town halls. And I think during those town halls is when I really realized, like, wow, historians are really cool. And they have like all the information that we need for these movements. Like, I realized that Paul Goodloe McIntyre was the person who donated these statues and commissioned the people, the sculptors, to build them. And he is, you know, the same man who donated the downtown library as a whites only space. And he also donated a park adjacent to Black neighborhoods in the 10th and Page neighborhood in Charlottesville, which is near downtown. And he dedicated Washington Park to be a Blacks only space. But what we found through this public forum process is that people had been doing digging on the significance of these spaces. And so they found that Washington Park was actually built on a landfill, built on top of a landfill. And so thinking about like, what are the implications of climate justice and spaces where Black people have been pushed to within cities, and what does that mean as far as health? And like, so we started to have these bigger conversations about environmental racism, about different forms of structural racism, and then we couldn't talk about these statues and the people who were involved in donating them without talking about Alderman, who was a president of the university and who was present during the unveiling of this statue and actually was a part of dedicating it. So we can't talk about all of these things without having the conversation about how the university has played a role in making Charlottesville its white supremacist landscape just like it is on grounds. And so I think for me, just like continuing to organize around getting them down has been a process, because then city council voted to put trash bags on top of the statues, and that lasted for a few months. And then that was ruled as like unconstitutional or illegal. And so the trash bags were taken down. And so the statues remain. And to a lot of people who are not from Charlottesville, they're like, oh, they're still there even after all that's happened over the past 3 years. And we're like, yeah, they're still here. Just like on grounds at UVA, the serpentine walls that line like the lawn. If you see any image of UVA, you see the rotunda and then you see the lawn. And the serpentine walls that guard the gardens outside of the lawn were originally built to keep out the sounds of enslaved laborers. And so literally it was last semester in one of the classes that I took that my professor said this, and the whole room was like, wow, I never knew this. Like, I've taken so many Instagram photos in the gardens. And so I think it's just so important that we are in the process of getting these monuments taken down, educating the public around the history behind them, because then you're able to uncover so many things that people never knew about. And so I think while I would love for the petition to have been voted on and the statues to have been taken down immediately, I appreciate the process in retrospect, because I understand that now I'm able to identify certain monuments throughout the city, like the Whispering Wall, where many students sit outside of one of our libraries on grounds and they read and they take cute photos, and that's actually a monument to Confederate soldiers. And so if we're not able to identify those things, we're passively like interacting with these things that are super harmful to Black people. And so I think it's just so important to have these public processes, kind of like it was alluded earlier, that we are having these transformative processes so that people can learn, and also so that we don't go back to building more monuments that just shouldn't be there in the first place.
Lauren?
Can I jump in just to kind of to amplify what I was saying? So when I was thinking about dropping the veil, it was exactly because I was like, how do we enact a public process of discourse? So I think what's really powerful right now, more so powerful than the spectacle, is the discourse that's happening. And that, to me, that process, like letting a process fully unfold and not being so quick to come to its conclusion, actually to me is where the power for radical transformation potentially lies, right? So just to say, like, that to me is what is really important about this moment. The ability for people to feel powerful to speak back and to actually see something physically change, but also like to hold the space for really powerful discourse to happen that like allows a process of transformation of a paradigm shift, consciousness, like all of those things. And so to me, as long as we can prolong that, we're actually in a great space.
I mean, this is a question for anybody. I want to make sure to follow up through here. Like, each of you have worked with political leaders or political systems, and each of you have pushed against or illuminated outside of it. And maybe this is a better question about balance, or at least practice. How do you kind of manifest your work in figuring out the moments to find the official process and the other ones where organizing, agitating ends up pushing that discourse or pushing what's necessary?
I know in Charlottesville, a lot of the times when we're taking to the streets or organizing demonstrations, it's things that we've already asked nicely for. Like, we've already went and made public comments at public meetings, and, you know, they've been pushed aside or they've been ignored. Most of the time, I think, honestly, a lot of us are now like professional FOIAs searchers or whatever. So we always are filing like requests to find out what is already being done on these issues before we start to organize around them, so that we understand, like, okay, this is what's happening and this is what's not happening. And so I think for us, like, talking about the statues and talking about narratives that have been erased has led to council putting more money into, I guess, like public history and talking about Charlottesville history. So the city council helped to give money to a Charlottesville pilgrimage, which we took in the summer of 2018, down to the EJI, to the memorial where there are all of the markers for people who were lynched around the country. And so, like, the city council was very like invested in that project and making sure that we were able to dig the soil of where a man named John Henry James was lynched in 1898, and we took that soil down to the EJI. And then we went through a public process of getting a marker put up in front of the court square in downtown Charlottesville. So there's balance there. And now, like, Charlottesville City Schools are working to tell more of the histories of local people and just like local Charlottesville stuff with regards to the statues and other things as well. And City Council is investing money into that as well. So I think it's a process. I think there are like ways where we're like, we need funding for this. But then when it comes to like defunding the police, like, there's no real easy way to come to the table with city councilors who work with the police. So it's really just building. I think for me, it's been a process of building our cases and finding ways to like crowdsource ideas within the community spaces or within organizing spaces, and then bringing them to city council to present them. And if those requests go ignored, then we find other ways to mobilize around the issues. But there have been city councilors who have joined us in the streets. There have been city councilors who went on the Charlottesville pilgrimage. So these are people who, you know, also live in our community. They're also friends with us. They're people that we interact with every day. And then on the university side, I think students have led a lot of that work to make sure that Charlottesville issues and UVA issues are being connected, and that both bodies are working towards equity.
I've been mostly incorporating these issues in my research and teaching for the past, many, many years. And some of that involves increasingly the development of courses that are designed more like practicums rather than these kind of abstract sort of theoretical seminars. And so my Monumental Anti-Racism class, for example, we're building a collaborative database. This is a first-year seminar at Washington University where students in their first year from various disciplines, some undeclared, join in studying the politics of public memory, and the specific focus of the course is on how memory work constitutes an increasingly important side of anti-racist struggle. And we read about that, we read academic work, we read popular work about that, but we also spend a lot of time building a collaborative database on examples of monumental anti-racism from all around the world. For example, sites of remembrance focused on the history of enslavement and its legacy. All of the Confederate memorial redress sort of work happening around the country. This fall, when we come back together, we're going to be working with all of these examples from around the world in the wake of George Floyd's killing, Breonna Taylor's killings, that where this commemorative reckoning has occurred. So I've done a lot of this. I mean, I like what Lauren was saying about her practice as an artist. I have a similar academic practice that I try to organize in a public-facing way by doing more accessible work, more collaboration with community-based organizations, also more digital projects, so less of the kind of standard. I still do the equivalent of what she was calling studio practice. I still do the scholarly writing and publication in journals and that kind of thing, but I try to translate this work as much as possible in ways that both engage broader publics and also push my students, challenge my students to translate their ideas into sort of actionable interventions. So the other thing my students do in the Monumental Anti-Racism course, if you go to that site, you'll see these examples of interventions. Every student has to develop a final project as an intervention where they identify a potential anti-racist commemorative effort and make a case for it. And in several cases, they've gone further and begun to talk with city officials. And this is their work is focused all over the country. But talk with officials, other stakeholders, and trying to see this work happen. The other thing I'll say about this balancing you mentioned is I just have to acknowledge again how much I'm benefited from by this tremendous wave of civic initiative that is, I think, largely should be credited to the artist community. I mean, the artist community has been really pushing this work, and Monument Lab and others have helped to elevate its visibility. I mean, I learned about people like Sonia Clark, for example, and her amazing fabric art around the Confederate flag of truce, which I learned about that through Monument Lab's podcast, and just was tremendously inspiring, and also helped me understand as a sociologist kind of how the country was really moving, the world was moving around these issues, and how important creatives have been in pushing us to this point. So I'm benefited from that in the sense of being able now to say, hey, I happen to be a professor of this and I study these issues, but dear Mayor, we should be doing work on this because you see it's important from everything happening around us, but also let me mention what we know from the social science research about how it's likely to be impactful. I also wanted to just really second what Lauren was saying about the importance of public moments of spectacle in, that really contest belonging, ideas of belonging and standing in a society that's been defined as a white place. And that's why I think these public moments of spectacle are so important. I'm reminded, Du Bois wrote this powerful essay called The Souls of White Folk, and it's a chapter in his book, Dark Water, where he says, quote, but what on earth is whiteness that one should so desire it? Then he says, he always asks himself this question. He says, then always somehow, some way, silently but clearly, I am given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen. And what's happening in this commemorative reckoning, I think that's so important, is contesting this proprietary aspect of whiteness. And demonstrating to people, Zai was talking about this, demonstrating to people who are in many cases unaware, who don't read the historical markers, never really stop to think about what the statue represents, who are not aware of how this proprietary aspect of whiteness is literally written into our landscape. And then when we can have those public forums that acknowledge this and commit to repair, I think that opens up, so I love Zai's point about the broader conversations that open up, questions around environmental justice, around other kinds of precarity that are also part of how white supremacy is written into our landscape. So I just wanted to really hold up that point about the importance of these spectacles as as moments for opening a conversation about acknowledging and dismantling white supremacy.
Geoff, I want to ask you a quick follow-up and then try to route through as best I can some of the conversation and questions that have come in by email or chat. We had a great opportunity and fortune to work with you and David Cunningham and your students last fall with the data collected in St. Louis, the 750 hand-drawn maps. What did you see, and what do you think by way of your observations, but also your students, about monuments in St. Louis through that data, both like what was collected, but also how you discussed it and how you grappled with these very conversations about power and about racism inscribed into landscape?
Yeah, so David and I, we've been working together for a long time on legacies of racial violence, and we were teaching two different classes, actually. I taught two classes where we engaged the maps, but I'll mention one of them in particular. David's class worked with them in a much more systematic way. I mean, you remember they built basically an exhibition of the maps where the students were tasked with organizing them in different ways and making sense of them. And they did this, for example, interesting groupings of maps by the age of the respondent. And that, I thought, revealed some interesting patterns, and also groupings based on whether these are existing or aspirational maps. Both of us as sociologists found this just a tremendous opportunity to engage with community-based institutions, arts institutions, creatives around similar kinds of questions that we're grappling with in those courses. I'll mention a couple things that stood out so my Monumental Anti-Racism class worked with the maps. We used it as a data set to explore the racial politics of public memory. And the question I put to the students was, and this was a very small class, about 6 students, and I asked them, what can you glean from this database? And just so people listening have more context, we had access to a spreadsheet that basically codified information that's in the maps. And we looked at the spreadsheet as well as some of the map examples. And asked them basically, without leading much beyond that, what do you see in the maps related to the racial politics of public memory? And one of the interesting things that students identified, and this goes back to my point about the proprietary aspect of whiteness, is they noticed that maps created by respondents who identified as white more often kind of assumed a proprietary stance. For example, they represented St. Louis as their city. They used terms like my city, my neighborhood, my favorite places, a really confident sense of belonging, they noticed. Whereas by contrast, Black respondents were more likely to convey a sense of alienation and social distance, remembering what was lost or stressing what is missing in the landscape in terms of memory, public memory, and in various other ways communicating displacement. And I want to say, this is by no means, these are anecdotal impressions. The students didn't analyze systematically the 750 maps. I don't think this would even be possible in terms of the politics of race because of all the noise in the data around like the race ethnic identity of the map maker and their ties to St. Louis and zip codes and stuff. But that reading seems entirely consistent with the centrality of racism to the spirit of St. Louis and to the built environment of St. Louis. So I found that really interesting. The other thing I found interesting, I won't say much about because I wrote about it in the essay you mentioned, is the iconoclastic kind of treatments of the arch, which your report demonstrated. The arch is second, like every other map has the arch unit or something like that. But several maps I found really interesting. To use Lauren's term, fucked with the arch. They moved it, like they made it straddle the Mississippi River rather than sit in downtown St. Louis. And I found those refigurings of the arch fascinating, and mostly because of how they focus our attention on the river. And really, and that for me, given the work I do, make the arch a kind of memorial, a more explicit memorial to the histories and legacies of empire and enslavement, the Mississippi River as America's Middle Passage. I just found those maps really fascinating. And I don't think that was the intention of most of the artists per se, but just those disruptions of the symbolism I found really interesting in the maps and fruitful as a as a conversation tool in my classes and beyond.
Thank you, Geoff. So I just want to note we have about 10 minutes left. We want to send people, kindly on their way after this, but I want to try to quickly go through a couple of questions and give each of the panelists a final word to amplify what they want to, or at least give us words to move forward. So a question from Aaron Keith, who's based in New York. I'm just read part of it. Do you feel like statues that need to be pulled down and remade, or is it better socially to remake them in the space completely to emphasize the removal of these negative icons? So this maybe goes back to some of the things we were talking about of like, it's not just the two options, or leave them up or take them down, but just curious to hear any of your takes on this question from Aaron Keith. Lauren?
So yes, so my position is recontextualization. And just to give you a quick note of where I'm coming from with that, I didn't really explain the drinking fountain project, but what I ended up producing through this moment of discovery of the white-only sign, which is I pushed an idea of recontextualization. I took the fountain, transformed the fountain into a video playing machine. So when you go, so I consider it an intervention, right? When you go to it, it just looks like a regular drinking fountain. You push the button, and instead of water coming on, a projection of a collection of images from the civil rights movement starts playing. You have to sit there and watch it before you can get water. So the water comes on after. And that created a big conflict as well, because everyone's like, it's Texas, it's too hot, we have to have water, right? It's like, nobody drinks out of water fountains that often anymore, but okay. So we got that done. And for me, that was a recontextualization, right? So I call that monument a drinking fountain to the organizers, right? It's acknowledging, and it creates a conversation around white only, what it took to get these signs removed, and then what the actual political context is now. So in that space, for a moment, it's under reconstruction right now, but we would host sort of political education, like in a county hallway, right, around different issues. And because we launched it in 2013, the movement for Black Lives was popping off and starting to happen, right? So we were able to have like different organizations come down to the monument and literally hold space in just a hallway to talk about contemporary issues. And so the idea was that I would keep adding in videos. That was the legacy of the civil rights movement up till today. So for me, with Confederate monuments, it's the same space for me that this could potentially happen in. In my city in particular, there's two monuments. One is Lee Park. That monument came down. Another is the Confederate Memorial, which is different from the Lost Cause sculptures, because it was actually built right after the Civil War to honor the dead, like dead people that were, tied to our city, the city. And that was moved to a place called Pioneer Park that was created to commemorate the pioneers of Dallas, which meant that you had a graveyard of like Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizards, like whoever, And then you had this like Confederate monument or memorial. And then you had this weird $9 million like atrocity called, it's the largest landscape sculpture in the world, according to Wikipedia, which is like a cattle drive of longhorns jumping over a river, right? So we have that also in Pioneer Park, which is literally signaling settler colonialism and indigenous genocide. So I wanted to fuck with that space. And I saw that the way to intervene on that and to create, to make an intervention where we could get people's history into this highly touristic space, I saw the way to do that was through this Confederate memorial. And to me, take down the guys on the statue, right? Let's talk about white supremacy. Let's talk about the markers that we have to put in place on a city level with funding, with structures to actually start to attack the system and let that monument actually represent the unfolding process toward that larger goal of justice. So that's what I would like to see happen, to hold those spaces so we can have something that's symbolic, that signals a process of holding people accountable and a process that is a protracted struggle toward justice, right? So that's where I land on it.
There's one question that relates to that. I'll just read it, and you don't necessarily have to respond just for the interest of time, but from Dana. If removing monuments is seen as an instigator for larger conversations about erasure or urban renewal, how can we facilitate transitions to these larger systemic dialogues? Some of this is also fodder and important work that you're doing already. It's not an either or, but it's just important to put out there. Just with our final moments, I want to just turn to each of you and give you a chance for a final word, and whether it's leaving us with some of the work that you're doing in your local sites and spaces, things that you're signal boosting or amplifying, or just intentions and words that you want for us. So Zai, I want to turn to you first. Each person has about a minute before we end, and we'll go around the group.
Okay, so I think this fight is ongoing, and I think there's a lot of work that still has to go down. But I want to be clear that, one, there can be no real reconciliation, no true healing without equity. And so I think a lot of communities are pushing around. So they're saying, you want to take down statues? Okay, let's also give some symbolic measures. Let's have healing, events. Let's have healing concerts. But there can't be any of that. There can't be any tying of loose ends until there's actual equity, until funds and resources are being redistributed, until communities get what they need to actually be on an equal playing field. And then I also think it's so important that we're centering the voices of the most marginalized people. And so I don't necessarily believe in leaders anymore. I think that we need to be leading horizontally instead of vertically. And I think that it's so important that we're centering the voices of Black trans people, non-binary Black and brown people, Indigenous voices. And so until those people are the most centered, until we're hearing from them, we're still perpetuating different types of violence against marginalized identities. So I think it's important to find the people in your area who are doing the work on the ground, who have been doing the work on the ground, and put your resources and time and energy behind them. And I saw a question about people who are allies to BLM. I think it's just so important to take inventory of your own identities and to question why you might say, oh, we don't need to take that statue down. Because if it offends any population that is marginalized, then it shouldn't be in public space, in my opinion. So just continue to unpack and listen and read and self-educate, but also show up in different ways.
Thank you. Thank you. Lauren.
Okay, what was the question? I got one.
A final word.
Final word. Well, I was going to bring it back to, because St. Louis is a second home for me. I was born in Kansas City. We moved to Texas when I was 2, but I always spent summers and every holiday in St. Louis. And then I, as an 18-year-old, made a choice to come back. So it wasn't until recently that I accepted my Texas identity, right? But I think it's like an interesting place to be. Dallas considers itself the beginning of the Southwest. St. Louis considers itself the beginning of the West, and St. Louis has a longer history. It's an older city. So I just wanted to bring it back to that and think, and this question made me start thinking about, because I don't, my professional sort of life doesn't intersect in St. Louis in the way it does in other cities. And so I really began to think about what monuments and memorials, what do I remember? What do I engage? Because for me, St. Louis is very much home. And I don't look at it through those lenses. So I just made a quick list, which is, I never considered the arch to be a monument. And now I'm like, actually, okay, it is. It's not just architecture. That's a really interesting thing. But I talked to some of my family and no one considers it a monument. It's just there, it's St. Louis, right? So I think it's a really interesting thing to start to think about that. And we also should think about what the meaning of monument is, right? We tend to think it only means commemoration or memorialization, but part of the etymology of monument is also to warn. And so we need to think about, how do we build monuments that also warn, of not commemorate something or memorialize something to warn about a future, but warn about what we are in right now, right? Warn toward a present future or something. So to think about it that way. So the arch, the Billiken sculpture in the middle of St. Louis University that I went and rubbed its belly every day when I was on campus for good luck. Random white guys and statues in parks. The fountains are what I remember, and to me those are sort of monumental. And then and I can't remember it, but the mall where all of that public art of random people and sculptures are outside of. Those things to me are the places that stick out in St. Louis. And then red brick, in churches. So so yeah, I'm just, it's really an interesting conversation to bring it to St. Louis, and congratulations on taking, you know, the Columbus statue down. Was that this week or something? So I'm interested to start following this right now, what's happening in the city.
Thank you, Lauren. And Geoff.
So two things I want to say. One is that this moment, I think, really speaks to the importance of the humanities, the arts, and one of the things I think we're in the midst of right now is undoing the destruction of the defunding of those endeavors, the neglect of those endeavors in, you know, K through 12 and universities. I think this moment teaches us how important fields like Black studies, ethnic studies, Indigenous studies are to all of us, to our country. And I think that one of the things I'm encouraged by is the outreach I'm receiving from high school teachers who want to figure out ways to engage their students in these conversations and this work. I think so that's one thing. I mean, this profound ignorance born of neglecting these topics, and then the misrepresentation of these histories is something that we have to address and not feel like we can resolve. You know, we're not going to sort of settle this and be done with it, but rather, you know, social movement scholars say, you know, freedom is a constant meeting. You know, racial justice will be a process that we will hopefully be forever committed to. Not this outcome will reach somehow magically in some period of time. The other thing I just wanted to mention is related to that constant meeting is, although we haven't been able to meet as much given the pandemic, is that here in St. Louis, a number of us are working together, and Lauren, you'd be invited. I can add you to our email list. I know you're in Dallas, but we have a group called the Reparative Justice Coalition of St. Louis, which is committed to grappling with histories and legacies of racial violence in our region, and in large part through commemorative projects. And so we would love to hear from people interested in working with us on these efforts. And I just encourage people wherever they are, if you want to get involved in these kind of projects, more likely than not, there are other groups of civic actors who are similarly engaged and would welcome your participation.
On that note, immense gratitude. Oh, Lauren, you got a final word?
Yes, I have one more thing. Yeah. Just to say, I was recently in a conversation with a coalition or a group of architects in LA that are thinking about public memory in LA. And LA has a different history of memory work and all of that. I just want to put out there that wherever we are, we can think about our built environment and the memories that are actually like literally embedded in our built environment. So shortly after that discussion in that architecture's forum, out of that came an LA Times piece that was talking about highways, right? What would it mean to think about highways? And so this was a question I posed to the group is, what we all have highways that have literally erased marginalized communities, Black communities. What would it mean to start to think about highways as a monument, right? Like if we actually say publicly, we're going to make this a monument, treat it as one. What does that mean about these everyday objects that we engage in? How do we start to reorient and think differently? So that's also I wanted to throw out there as a final word.
Yeah, well, I want to just say immense gratitude for Zyahna Bryant, Lauren Woods, and Geoff Ward. Please make some noise in your own house, shake the tables, hit the pots and pans, just thank you. And folks, also as a way to show gratitude, follow them on social media, read their work and cite their work as we continue. Immense gratitude to the team at the Pulitzer for their support in this, for all of you for being here with us tonight. We invite you to join for other programs this week. Tomorrow, there's a discussion at 12 noon Central Time, Racist Monuments in Our Backyard, St. Louis Justice Efforts. We'll be releasing the podcast interview with Mad Dad, that's Dee Nichols, Mallory Rexana Nazam, and Damon Davis. You can get that podcast by searching the Apple Store or Spotify for the Monument Lab podcast. And then on Wednesday, there's a mapping and data session led by Lori Allen and other members of the Monument Lab and Pulitzer teams. Folks, I just want to thank you for being here, and good evening, keep in touch, and keep on.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.